Chairman, to Mr. DeGood, during the first panel, we heard from more than one witness who mentioned that infrastructure investment and consequently the effects of climate change have historically fallen disproportionately on low-income and minority communities. You raised that point in your testimony. Why is this, and does solving this issue fall on the federal, state, or local government?
I think it's important to recognize that for the most part, state and local governments are the ones who are making project selection decisions and acting as the project sponsor. So for the most part, the federal government acts as a fairly passive funder or co-funder. You know, and I mentioned in my testimony the importance of public participation in the planning process, and I can't stress that enough. You know, there have been calls at times to try to limit the scope of environmental review, to put artificial deadlines on how long it can take for projects to go through that process. And I think that that's the wrong way to go about it. What we have seen when we've done these lookbacks is that with a little bit more thought on the front end, we can reduce the level of impact both on natural environments as well as our local communities. And I think the underlying challenge is that when many of these project decisions were made in the 60s and 70s, we just had a political system that didn't particularly care so much what communities of color had to say. And I think it's about empowerment and making sure that people have a seat at the table.
And what can we do to make sure that it doesn't reoccur again if, in fact, we've learned lessons about climate change and begin to change course in how we address it?
I think that's a good question. I think it really comes back to making sure that elected officials are held accountable and that planners are held accountable for making sure that people have had a chance to have their voice heard during the project planning phase.
Another question on natural infrastructure. Can you provide some examples of how we can save money by utilizing natural infrastructure over investing further in man-made structures?
Right. You know, I think the witness down at the end probably has more to say about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, there are all kinds of natural infrastructure, but I'll mention one where there are clear cost savings, and that is with stormwater management and addressing combined sewage overflow problems in cities. And Philadelphia pioneered use of natural infrastructure, and at a fraction of the cost of what it would have taken to, for example, dig under the streets, build bigger pipes and tunnels and so forth. We're seeing that in Detroit. The Nature Conservancy is involved in a partnership there, in Los Angeles, here in Washington, D.C. So that's one example where there are very clear cost efficiencies with use of natural infrastructure. In other cases, on coastal resilience, we've done a look at natural infrastructure, at traditional infrastructure, and then at hybrids, and find sometimes that the hybrid comes in most cost effective.
Thank you. And for Mr. Proctor, how do we create a well-coordinated, well-funded effort to educate the public on the importance of investment in our infrastructure? And the second question is, what efforts are we making here at the national level to drive public support, to build public support for investments in infrastructure that is needed, and of course mindful of the fact that there will be opportunities for public-private collaboration and partnerships, given that you come from the private sector?
Well, excuse me. Unfortunately, the water sector traditionally has been sort of out of sight, out of mind. When a constituent hits a pothole in a road, elected officials or operators hear about it. When the water system is deteriorating and water's leaking out into the ground, people don't know about it, and so it doesn't get the same degree of attention. One of the ways that we could educate the public so that the issues become more prominent would be to, first of all, ensure that all of our utilities know what the full cost of their operations are, including the cost associated with losing 30% of the water that goes into our pipelines. Less than a third of the utilities in the country have that appreciation of their full cost. Once the utilities know those costs, and one of the ways to do that, as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, is through doing water leak audits. Once we know what those full costs are, then we need to have a level of transparency that ensures that the public is aware of the extent of the loss that's going on and the extent of the true cost of providing the water service that many of us take for granted.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you.